global supply chainers. Hopefully you know me by now. I'm Alexis Bateman. I'm a research scientist at the Center for Transportation and Logistics here at MIT, and I'm also the course lead for SC3x Supply Chain Dynamics. So today we're having our third live event, and we're really fortunate to have Bruce Klafter, Vice President of Corporate Social and Environmental Responsibility from Flex, a major electronics manufacturer and a lot of other things. He'll give you a little bit more background on what Flex is in just a minute. So I just want to do a really brief course update. So we're right now in our week 11 for SC3X. If you're in that course, that is our prep week right before the final exam. So make sure you're prepping for the final exam. Go check, review lessons you struggled with, try some more of the practice problems and all that. So that'll go live next Wednesday at 1500 UTC. So just make sure you take some time to prepare for that. We also have the SCREAM, a resilience and risk mitigation exercise game running right now. It's a brand new web version. So if you want to go in and try that out, you can see how you do relative to your peers. So that's open in this week as well. So make sure to give that a chance. It's a pretty interesting exercise, and you can post and discuss with some of your peers about what you're seeing and what you've done. So now we're really fortunate. I want to spend most of the time with Bruce because we're very lucky to have him today, to have him chat a little bit about his work. So Bruce was really an expert in sustainable supply chains and has led corporate social and environmental responsibility at Flex for the last 5 years. And previous to that was the managing director of corporate responsibility at Applied Materials for 12 years. In his work, he really leads efforts towards addressing some of the most challenging environmental and social issues occurring in the supply chain. Prior to his work in corporate social responsibility, he actually served as a Deputy Attorney General for the California Department of Justice, so he has a wide range of expertise. And in his current work, he also serves on a number of sustainability advisory boards, including the Electronics Industry Citizenship Coalition. So we're really lucky to have him. Thanks for joining us, Bruce.
Yeah, my pleasure, Alexis. Happy to be here.
And so I don't know if you want to take a few minutes and just introduce yourself and Flex a little bit more, and then we'll dive right into some question and answer.
Yeah, very good. Thank you. If we could put the couple of slides up there regarding Flex.
Perfect. Yeah, it's on the title slide.
Okay. Let's go to the first one. Okay, the next one. It's a little bit of a lag here. There we go. So a little bit about Flex. We're one of those kind of large, stealthy companies that people may not hear about, primarily because we're a service-oriented business, essentially business to business exclusively. Significant amount of revenue, as you can see. I'll show you the footprint in just a moment, but we operate in, I think, 32 countries today, and we employ over 200,000 people. Back in the day, they used to refer to companies like ours as contract manufacturers when we were primarily executing orders on behalf of customers. Today, we do quite a bit more than that, and Flex refers to itself as a sketch to scale company, which connotes the fact that we work much earlier with many customers on design and other issues relative to their products. But when they are ready to bring those to market and they need to scale it up, we also have the bandwidth to produce the product in large volumes. And our structure is quite regionalized. We operate in basically every part of the world except Africa, which enables us to situate the manufacturing where it's most advantageous for the customers. And that's dependent upon proximity to the markets that they serve. It's dependent upon capacity, labor, many other factors that I'm sure some of you have discussed in this class. So you want to go to the next slide? Still a bit of a lag here. There we go. So we have over $1 billion worth of business in 12 different markets, and I won't go into this in any great detail. I just wanted to illustrate the fact that electronics today is an extraordinarily diverse type of business. So what we were traditionally doing the types of consumer and other industrial products that you might be able to imagine today has expanded considerably. So healthcare devices include electronics. Today, an automobile is essentially a rolling electronic device with multiple microprocessors and other types of electronic components in it. Our homes today are much more connected than they ever were. And a fast-growing sector of the electronics business is also what's called wearables. So you could think of smart watches, but today increasingly garments and other types of products are also incorporating electronics so that they can transmit information to the owner and to others for analytical purposes. Next slide.
It's live on our end.
Yeah, I'm getting quite a bit of a lag here. So just very quickly, this will be the last thing I'll illustrate before we get into the discussion. This just shows our global footprint with nearly 100 factories around the world, but this also has distribution centers and what we call design centers, where our customers, both big and small, come in to work with us on their latest concepts, and we can help them incorporate the appropriate technologies and probably more importantly, work with them on design for manufacturability. So a great idea is not truly great unless it can be executed, and that's one of the services we provide to our customers. So quite an extensive footprint. The largest regions in terms of square feet as well as the number of employees would be China and Mexico, not surprisingly for a variety of reasons, but we still remain the largest electronics manufacturer in the United States based upon the amount of square feet and facilities that we have. So if and when onshoring becomes more of a reality, we're well positioned to serve that market as well. So I think we can get into the discussion now, Alexis.
Great, perfect. Okay, that's great to learn a little bit more about Flex. I think that Flex is such a interesting company, and one that maybe some don't know as well because it's not business to consumer. So a little background there. So I introduced your background a little bit, but I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about your role at Flex and really how you came into this role.
Yeah, sure thing. So what I get to do is work across the entire company on both the social and environmental responsibility of our operations. And given the type of diversity of products that we help our customers manufacture and the locations I just illustrated, there are quite a number of issues that arise. So if you think about a corporate function like the one that I lead, the first thing that we do is help the company establish what are the standards for our conduct. So we maintain our code of conduct, we maintain all of the policies and procedures that are in our manual, including things like the human rights policy, the environmental health and safety policy, and so on. We provide leadership and strategy to the company on those subjects. And so I interact, again, with functions all around the company as well as senior leadership, occasionally the board of directors to update them as well. One very important function in a corporation is internal assessment and auditing, and I'm responsible for leading the team that does that work within the company. And then we also are very involved externally with our customers, with collaborative efforts like the Responsible Business Alliance that you mentioned earlier, and quite a number of others. So it's incredibly diverse. Supply chain is part of it, but a lot of time is also spent directly on establishing both the standards as well as the practices within our own factory footprint.
Right. Great. Yeah. So actually, we also just polled our students who are online, and it looks like we asked them sort of where do they work in their supply chain. Given that you've kind of working across the supply chain across the company, so about 20% are the majority is in manufacturing, about 26%, 12% in retailing, 15% in warehousing, and 35% actually in logistics. and then there's 22% in end-to-end or another category. So we got students coming from many supply chain positions, getting different angles of that.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, and I work with all of those functions. Just to give you one other illustration with logistics, I'm working with some colleagues there doing our carbon footprinting. So we're engaged directly with our largest third-party logistics providers, and that covers two areas. We have a tremendous amount of incoming material, so this is upstream of our operations. And then we have a very large operation where we distribute the products that we're manufacturing, so that's downstream. And today, one of the biggest issues is how can you choose the right mode of distribution to reduce your impact? So we would like to go to ocean freight, for instance, in many instances. But if we need to get it to market much quicker, depending upon what the customer requires, that might not be feasible.
Right. Yeah. Much different timelines. So that's definitely a kind of a grapple there. So on that kind of vein, can you talk, more about sort of the various work in sustainable supply chains you do on top of sustainable logistics, and how is really the supply chain affected by implementing more sustainability?
The basic premise, I think, of what we're trying to do at Flex, and this is true of most leading companies, is we essentially want to do business with like-minded suppliers. So we're looking for suppliers who also have a demonstrated commitment to sustainability, and hopefully we're able to establish that in our relationship with them. So if you think about the stages of a relationship with a supplier, from qualification on through the engagement, the ordering, and so on, at each stage of that relationship, there's a role for sustainability. So we play a big part in the qualification process. And then as we assess the performance of suppliers, today, sustainability is one of those key elements, along with the more traditional ones like quality, cost, timing of delivery, and so on. Traditionally, when manufacturing companies measured their suppliers on performance, those traditional factors were the only ones they looked at. But today, we're looking to make certain that they operate in the right fashion and they're able to maintain that performance. And we have a few what we call showstopper issues, things that I'm sure anyone on the webinar will appreciate are things that we simply cannot tolerate. That would be the existence of underage labor within the factory. Forced labor is another issue that's emerging as a big showstopper. And then serious environmental issues could potentially rise to that level as well. So today, a lot of sustainable supply chain management is based upon how we collect, sort, and analyze all of that information. And then the real opportunities are in engaging with willing suppliers on things that go beyond compliance, like energy management, carbon reduction, the logistics endeavors I mentioned before. Those sorts of things are all well beyond compliance.
Sure, right, absolutely. So you actually, I think, already answered my next question about some of the social environmental risks in terms of showstoppers. So clearly, some of those are happening and being aware of in the supply chain. So we're going to run a quick poll now, which kind of comes on this, Flex being proactive in this place. But do you feel, or we'll run the poll of, do you think firms should be held responsible for their actions in the supply of their suppliers? And so, kind of to segue into that, what is one of the biggest challenges that you have encountered managing sustainability in the supply chain?
Well, there are quite a number. I mean, the first I would say is scale and complexity. So it's hard to generalize here, but probably electronics has among the most complex value chains in sectors that you will find. A typical electronic product, or a product that's got some electronics embedded in it, can have hundreds, if not thousands, of components. And so in order to establish that the product is sustainable, whatever that might mean, whatever your definition is, can be a very large undertaking just to interact with each and every one of the suppliers of those components. Now, what's making it even more challenging today is we have a imperative to sometimes take the value chain in that product all the way back to the raw materials that go into it. So sourcing of minerals and other substances has become a huge issue in supply chain management, which means that we find ourselves in places like the Congo in Africa trying to determine whether or not so-called conflict minerals are being managed properly. That's very new in the last, half a dozen years, and I think the trend towards that sort of due diligence is only going to accelerate.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, so kind of continuing on to that, in terms of the conflict mineral issues and North Korean labor sanctions and other kind of issues there, what are some of your biggest challenges in getting visibility into the supply chain to address those social and environmental issues? Can you kind of talk through an example and some technologies that you leverage to get some of that visibility?
Well, I think a lot of what particularly large companies do in tackling that particular challenge is to take a risk-based approach. So in some instances, it's just not possible to establish that each and every link in that chain is going to be managed responsibly, simply because as you go further upstream, oftentimes the relationship between the assembler or manufacturer, like a Flex, is very tenuous. I mean, it's basically non-existent. We don't have a contractual relationship with many of those actors. And so try as we might to get responses from them about who they are and what they're doing, in many cases, they're simply non-responsive. And there's lots of explanations for that. I mean, number one would be that in many cases, they're simply not well educated on these issues. And so when the requests filter down to them, they're not able to intelligently respond. So there's a lot of industry effort going on to educate all the players here. But in other cases, they simply may not be incentivized or feel compelled, certainly, to respond because the amount of spend to them just seems very small. They're not motivated to respond. So, we all kind of collectively try and lean on the various actors to get completeness of responses, but it's just sometimes not possible.
Sure.
I'll just give you one example. We have a very large conflict minerals due diligence program, and we query over 5,000 suppliers. These are all direct to Flex, 5,000 suppliers every year. And even this program having been in existence for 4 or 5 years now, our response rate is still only in the 60 to 70% range. So we've still got a third or more of those suppliers from whom we simply do not get responses.
Right, right. So a significant challenge getting any kind of feedback there. What are the kind of efforts to ramp that up, or is that just an ongoing challenge?
It's ongoing. I mean, I think the intelligence of the industry's conflict minerals approach is that they've identified sort of the key part in the value chain, which are the smelters and refiners. So these are the locations where the raw materials are then refined into a form that can be used in products. And what we've tried to do is establish that all of those smelters are being operated according to the code of conduct. They're not employing children. They're not funneling proceeds to armed groups and so on. And increasingly, we see customers come to us and say, if we do not have information about a smelter or refiner, or if it appears to be deficient in some way, we want that removed from our supply chain. So we're gradually disengaging with certain suppliers who are either not responsive or who are not adhering to the code.
Right. Right. Great. Thanks. Yeah. So on our poll on do you think firms should be held responsible for the actions of their suppliers, we have a positive group here. So they believe yes. So 58% believe yes, the majority, 4% no, and 38%, which is always the good answer, is it depends.
Yeah, that's always my favorite answer as well. And I have to say that kind of channeling some of my prior legal background, that there's a fine line that most companies walk between establishing an expectation for a supplier and then trying to manage them to that expectation and controlling them. So no company wants to be seen as controlling another party, because then you might assume liability for what they're doing or they're not doing. So that's why I mentioned in some cases the remedy is not necessarily to assert control, but to suspend business, to reduce the amount of business you're sending them, or in the worst cases, you might have to disengage from doing business with them. Of course, one other complication is there are certain suppliers who would be deemed critical for one reason or another. You might be sole sourced for a particular component, or they may be the only ones with sufficient supply of a component. And we always make an attempt to try and work with a supplier to mitigate an issue, and hopefully they'll be successful, but sometimes that just doesn't happen.
Sure. Yes, absolutely. So we talked a little bit about how the regulation is forcing the hand in some cases, Dodd-Frank and others. What about public and stakeholder pressure? Is that affecting what you guys are doing, or is that less of an issue because you're B2B?
We don't see a lot of pressure directly applied to Flex, but I have to say it does kind of filter down at times, and I'll mention a couple of trends. So you talked about the public. One of the trends that I see is in using procurement power to affect supply chains in one fashion or another. So particularly governmental entities, not only in the United States, but in many parts of the world. Scandinavia, for instance, is an area where there's a lot of that activity. So what governments have decided is, look, we are ourselves large consumers of many products, and if we establish for ourselves standards for the purchase of those products, we can potentially impact supply chains in a positive way. Now, I think a lot of that began with what I'll call simpler products, things like apparel and so on, but they're increasingly putting their attention to electronics because of the press that has surrounded some of these issues, things like conflict minerals, as well as cobalt in Africa, tin mining in various parts of the world, and so on. The other phenomenon that you'll see in this space is that the biggest and most visible brands, companies like Apple, Amazon, and others, tend to get attacked, if you will, by stakeholder groups. And the result, of course, is that those brands will then move as quickly as they possibly can to work with their manufacturing partners and other members of their supply chain to determine, first of all, is there really an issue here? And of course, if there is, they're going to want to see it addressed very quickly and very completely. So it does filter down. I mean, the tactic that the stakeholder groups use is not surprising. They can clearly garner a lot more attention and probably a lot more action by going after the brands than they could by going after a relatively unknown partner of theirs in the supply chain somewhere.
Sure. Right. Absolutely. That seems makes sense that it would be
yeah. And just let me add one more thing. I was going to say, I mean, the other phenomenon, however, is that a lot of times this pressure doesn't seem to have great impact in the marketplace. I mean, I think I could count a significant number of exposés, for instance, about Apple, very damning headlines, covers on magazines, and so on. It doesn't really seem to impact their share price or their operations greatly, and so on. And I think the other thing that has not caught up to the public procurement trend I mentioned is that individual consumers, even those of us who are very well informed, we don't tend to make our purchases based upon these criteria. So, everybody on this call could ask themselves, how often do I go into a store and think real hard about how socially or environmentally responsible the producer of this product is, whether it's electronics, food and beverages, an automobile, and so on. It just really hasn't permeated consumer behavior yet, at least in my view.
Sure. Yeah, in our research, we've seen similar things, which is a little bit disheartening, but we've seen that the biggest concerns are things that people eat and put in their body, and then less so what they put on their body and what's around them. So we're kind of
Yes.
seeing a phased in terms of concern. But okay, great, thanks. So we'll run our next poll just to kind of see what's students in your work, where do you see some of the biggest environmental and social impacts? So if you're seeing it around you, and if you could just try to limit it to one word, just in terms of your perception of where those impacts are. So we'll jump to a little bit of a different topic, and wondering, what can you talk a little bit about Flex's role in extended producer responsibility and product take back, and how this might affect your design and production? Is this something that is pressing on you, or how's that impacting your work?
Yeah, we have an entire group, in fact, that offers those sorts of services to customers. So remanufacturing of products, refurbishment of products, repair of products. Now, for companies like ours, and for most of the brands that we're familiar with, a lot of that activity takes place while the product is still under warranty. So you purchase a product, it's got let's say a 2 or 3 year warranty. It does not operate as advertised. You return it. It's then given to a company like Flex, where we'll perform diagnostics on it, and make the repairs, and return it to the brand. Now, the brand may redeliver it to you, or they may have given you a new model, and now they're going to resell a product and brand it as refurbished. And I'm sure we've all seen examples of that. What we're seeing today is more customers coming to us looking for completely circular services, as well as design concepts, so that they can not only do all those sorts of things I just mentioned, but eventually take back the product after the warranty period has expired, after the product has served its useful life. And we're helping customers figure out how to harvest the useful parts, how to recycle them and reuse them in some cases. And we have a couple of interesting examples I'll mention. We have an operation that we run for a company that produces multifunction devices. So these are copiers, the type you see in your offices and so on. Now, they promote circularity by primarily leasing those devices. So what that means is, when it comes off lease, they collect the device, it comes back into our factory, we do the type of diagnostics I mentioned earlier, and then we go about repairing it and putting it back in basically a brand new condition. So we pound out dents, like an auto body shop, we pull off parts. And what distinguishes this particular operation from some of our others, we actually have an on-site recycling operation there, where we will shred plastic parts and metal parts, and then we reuse it as feedstock for making new parts that go back into the machines. We deliver them back to this customer, and then they release them again. So a perfect example. It works well for the types of products that have fairly significant residual value. I think one of the challenges for the industry is, how do we promote more of that in fast-moving products that don't have as long a useful life, don't have as much residual value. And you mentioned design. That's a critical component of it, because if you design the product in less than an optimal fashion, you can make it very hard on yourself to disassemble it. You can make it very hard to reuse the materials. And in some cases, you're forced to dispose of more of the product content because of those choices you made back in the design phase. So design for environment is a big topic today.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And that's really interesting, kind of the different models now, and seeing more things like surfacization, where you take it back, and it's sort of the life of the use instead of just the single use product. So that's it's interesting to see that it's impacting you guys as well. So actually in our poll, we're seeing a lot of different ways that environmental and social impact is impacting some of our learners are saying. We're seeing a lot of plastic. Data centers as a big energy source. E-waste obviously is becoming sort of an issue that they're saying as well, seeing as well. And what are the other ones? Labor has come up a couple times, and then logistics and transportation. So kind of across the board in terms of where they're seeing it in their work in terms of big environmental and social impact.
Yeah, we probably touch on all of those issues. Our biggest business by revenue is in networking and communications equipment, and the companies whom we work with there, either on data center products or others, are very interested in the energy consumption for those products. And actually, that's another good example of circularity. Many of the companies in that space are able to take those types of products out of service and remove a lot of the components and reuse them, because it's back in a data somewhere, it's not visible, it's not a consumer product. So they are exclusively focused on functionality and less on things like aesthetics and so on.
Right, right, great. So I'm gonna just run through one or two more questions. I really want to get to the student questions because there's quite a few populating, and that's they have some great questions waiting. So we'll just run our last poll and just make sure everyone on that to go and fill it out on poll at Slido. So for students, if in your role, have you seen requests for more social and environmental responsibility in the supply chain by consumers or buyers? As Bruce had kind of touched on, that some buyers are kind of pressuring their suppliers to then integrate more social and environmental responsibility. So on that kind of note, Bruce, how have you seen sustainable supply chain management change over the last 20 plus years that you've been in it, really?
Well, I think you just mentioned one of the key ones, which is I'll call customer pressure or customer interest, certainly. And part of that is related to the way business is done today. So businesses like Flex grew because companies wanted to get out of the manufacturing end of the business. So electronics is a perfect example of a sector that's very highly outsourced, globalized, and so products are assembled from materials that come from all over the world. And so what that means is a brand that wants to establish its own responsibility has to be concerned about the responsibility of its partners, its supply chain partners. And so I like to say sometimes that we're effectively an extension of their business. So if you come to a Hewlett Packard or an Apple or any of the brands you recognize and you ask them, are your products made responsibly? The only way they can answer that question is to assure themselves that their partners like Flex and others are acting responsibly as well. So I see a lot more engagement with our customers, and it's moved from the early stages where they would put out very large specifications, codes, and things of that nature to genuine one-on-one engagement where we work together to try and mitigate issues, or as I mentioned before, to capture opportunities. So we look at attributed emissions, we look at electricity consumption, we look at material usage like we just discussed, and we certainly share interest with them in the welfare of all of the workers whom we employ, as well as our suppliers' workforces.
Great. So kind of continuing on with that. Now that we've talked about how it's changed over the last 20 years, what are future issues you see emerging as related to sustainability and to supply chains, and how do you think the students can prepare themselves, really in any position for some of these emerging issues?
Well, one thing I think that's worth recognizing, for everybody, is there is certainly a shift moving in terms of the level of focus. Now, let me explain what I mean by that. So, I think traditionally the focus was at the enterprise level in kind of the earliest stages of supply chain management. So, we would establish that at the enterprise level, Flex or some other partner had the right policies, procedures, commitments in place, and so on. In the last number of years, it's moved very quickly to focus upon factories. So then the question was not just, is Flex a well-managed, responsible company? Can you help me understand that the factory that's being used to manufacture our products is itself being run in a good manner? So we will oftentimes see customers say, we want you to perform an audit at the half dozen factories that are used to assemble our products. Now, what's emerging today, and that is making sustainable supply chain management so much more challenging, is now the emphasis in some cases is shifting to the product, and we talked about this a little bit. So when you want to establish that an entire product is assembled in a sustainable fashion, well, then you're going to perhaps go all the way back to the raw materials that are in all of those components, and all of a sudden you've magnified the due diligence challenge considerably, many times over. And as I said, in some cases there's issues with non-responsiveness or lack of visibility for many other reasons, and this makes it really tough, in some cases, the issues you're dealing with are just intractable. I mean, they're very difficult to manage or mitigate. So if there's tin in the solder in all of my components, and a good percentage of it is derived from a mine in Indonesia that's got some very serious environmental issues, I can't really easily resolve the issues at that mine. So I'm left with a very difficult challenge of, could we potentially remove that particular source of tin from the supply chain? So these are all new sorts of issues and becoming very tough for us.
Right. And is there any advice you think that students can kind of prepare themselves for some of these coming down the line?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think you really do have to be essentially a lifelong learner to be in this business. So you've got to be attuned and aware of these sorts of issues that I mentioned, perhaps around the entire world. I can't say that I'm consuming, news necessarily from every part of the globe, but I'm certainly staying on top of professional journals and publications and so on, trying to spot the emerging trends to get in front of them, because you don't want to have to deal with it right in the midst of what might be termed a crisis in one form or another. The other thing that I think is quickly emerging, and certainly everyone needs to be aware of and hopefully well versed in at some point, would be new technologies that can help us address some of these issues. So remote monitoring for energy management, water management, and so on. Potentially the use of blockchain or similar technologies for traceability of certain types of components or products. And very quickly, we're also seeing the application of advanced analytics, whether it's machine learning or artificial intelligence, to analyze information and help us spot trends, because we're in this age of big data and it's not as easily manipulated as it once was. And so if we're really going to, for instance, tackle that product level due diligence and amass a huge amount of data, I might need new tools to figure out what I'm looking at there.
Right. Absolutely. No, that's great. And actually, you're talking to the right crowd, because we got a whole group of lifelong learners who are really kind of proactively trying to educate themselves on some of these issues, and then kind of segueing actually exactly what Bruce was talking about, some of the exact issues. We're going to be touching on that in SC3x supply chain technology and systems. So if you guys aren't already enrolled, I suggest you enroll now, because it's starting right away.
Yeah.
So Great. So let me just review our last poll, and then I'm going to start taking questions from the crowd. So in terms of their roles, our group has seen more requests for social environmental responsibility from consumers or buyers. A majority says yes, 39%. 27% say no. 6% say I'm not sure, and 27% say that's not my position. So it does seem at least a significant majority are seeing requests from consumers and buyers.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me. And one other thing I'll just close on that question with is, I think it's also very important to be networking and to identify opportunities for collaboration. Even a company as large as ours, I think some of the most valuable work that we do is really in collaboration with others, not just customers, but competitors and other actors within the supply chain, because we simply don't have the resources to tackle these things ourselves. I could not put people on the ground in the Democratic Republic of the Congo to do the due diligence, but the industry associations we belong to are able to pull that together, and then we can leverage it.
Right, right. Yeah, absolutely. That's always promising, sort of these industry collaborations that are making progress there. Great. All right. So we have quite a few questions coming in. So I'm just going to start pulling ones that have been upvoted. So many people voted for them. So one of our esteemed CTAs, Param, has asked, with the advent of IoT, we are likely to see far more prevalence of electronic items across the world, as you've already mentioned. How can this increase in e-waste be made sustainable?
Yes, I think that's definitely going to be a pressing issue in the future. And I mentioned one of the ways of addressing that, which is design for environment. So I think you've got to choose materials carefully. I'll just give you one example. We had a medical, healthcare company come to us. We've been working with them on quite a number of products. And because of issues with hygiene and transmission of germs and so on, a lot of things in the medical industry are single use and then disposable. So in this particular instance, they said, look, we're asking you to make 50 million units of this particular device. Is there a material that would be degradable, biodegradable, or much more easy to break down in the environment than the one that we're currently using? And we worked with them to identify the right material for that. So all those sorts of questions are going to need to be asked about this, this plethora of devices that we're going to see everywhere.
Sure, absolutely. Great. So now pivoting a little bit. So Mike G asks, in class, so in our class, we're actually talking about supply chain risk and risk management, which you've touched on a little bit, but can you tell us a little bit about how Flex monitors your global supply chain and responds quickly? And I know this is a strength of your guys with increasing awareness and visibility. So any comments on that?
Yeah, let me describe the approach a little bit. So as I mentioned before, it's risk-based, and what that means is we typically begin with what we call our preferred suppliers. So these are the suppliers from whom we purchase the largest amounts of material or services. And so while our overall supply chain is comprised of thousands of suppliers, the number of preferred suppliers is in the hundreds. So we focus more attention on them, which enables us to say that we've got a large percentage of our spend covered. Then we start to sort through the other suppliers based on various criteria, and that could be geography. Do they happen to operate in a risky part of the world? What sort of commodity are we talking about? Is it one that's produced with a chemically intensive process? Are they located in an area, or is it the type of business that requires a lot of labor, which might mean that we have some underage labor or forced labor risks? And so we're kind of funneling in that fashion and then focusing our attention in that way. I do anticipate that with some additional tools being put in place, some new software platforms that we're putting in, we could probably spend more time with all of the suppliers, but right now we have to zero in on the riskiest ones.
Absolutely, right. With the number of suppliers you have, makes the most sense. So Daniel Amezqua has asked, so he comments that Nike is a customer for Flex now. There have been cases where Nike uses Nike suppliers use child labor. How is Flex ensuring that that's not the case in current operations?
Yeah, our operation that we set up for Nike happens to be in Guadalajara, Mexico. We created a factory for them, and the idea was that it would include advanced automation. So while we do still employ thousands of people there in the factory, we also have a very high amount of automation of machinery in the factory, and we're just producing shoes for them, so no electronics. It's a new operation for us. I think Nike is an extraordinary company in terms of their commitment today. They're not the same company that they were many years ago, or alleged to be many years ago. So they're a great partner. And we manage that particular factory within our overall campus to exactly the same standards that we run all of our operations to. And so I don't think that factory is in any way reflective of some of the issues that are alleged to be in primarily the Asia region, with Bangladesh and many other parts of the world where garments are produced. So it's been a great collaboration, and hopefully we'll expand in the future. But it begins with establishing that we would run this operation to our standards as well as Nike's high standards right from the outset.
Right. Great. And in terms of, sort of the distance there, in terms of having it in Mexico versus in Asia, do you think there's any issues in terms of that you have more control, or is that not a factor?
Well, the location is based upon some of the factors I mentioned before. In this case, it was proximity to the North American market, essentially. That's why the first factory went in there.
Sure.
Nike is pursuing a concept called mass customization in part. So the idea is that any of us who are consumers of their products would be able to go on, order the product, and customize it in some ways. The order would be placed, it would be produced as quickly as possible in this new factory, and then it would be shipped and be on your doorstep in a relatively small amount of time. And so in order to do that, all the factories that they employ for this purpose are going to be close to large markets, whether it's the United States, later in Europe, and then potentially in parts of Asia as well.
Right. Great. So remember, everyone, if you see a question on there that you want to upvote, that makes it easy. I will ask that one probably more likely, knowing that you guys are interested in it. So just to jump to one, and you mentioned it briefly, and I know it's a hot topic for everyone right now. Bobby asks, has Flex looked at the use of blockchain technology for verifying suppliers and in the supply chain, and what challenges have you observed, if so?
We have examined it. We've spoken to a number of partners who are active in that space. I'm sort of counting myself as one of the blockchain skeptics at the moment, at least based on my understanding of it. I think it is very well suited to tracing, establishing the provenance of certain products. I know it's being used, for instance, for fisheries, so that when a large tuna is landed, it's placed in the blockchain ledger, and then it's traced from that point on, so that when it finally reaches the grocery or whatever the destination is, they can establish this was the same fish caught responsibly, and so on. The difficulty, in my view, with using blockchain for some of the issues that we've mentioned here is that there are so many factors involved in judging whether or not an operation is socially and environmentally responsible that it's difficult to make an entry in a ledger, electronic or otherwise, that conveys all of that information. A typical audit of a factory might have 300 or more different criteria that are looked at, and the results are going to be nuanced. They're not going to be black and white. It may be that something is in a perfectly acceptable condition, or it may just be marginally acceptable, and then we're going to require remediation. So at the moment, I don't see that blockchain can easily be used for all of those purposes. So I'm keeping a very close eye on it, and seeing what vendors and others are going to offer in the way of use cases. So inside Flex, we are beginning to use blockchain for more traditional management of financial transactions first.
Okay, great. Yeah, that's we've kind of seen the range of perspectives on blockchain recently, and it's great to hear sort of a more cautious perspective. We've seen similar things in some of our research where the data is a challenge, and even getting the correct data is it kind of upstream suppliers collecting and inputting that data is the existing challenge. So to jump, so Sumant asks. For some companies, CSR is really up and beyond above the main operations of the business. And so he wonders, so for supply chain managers, how important it's to kind of grapple with corporate social responsibility as compared to the main operations of the business?
Yeah, another really good question. And this is a phenomenon that we see quite a bit. I mentioned before that in some cases, the supply chain needs to be educated about particular issues. Well, we clearly recognize that particularly for smaller and medium-sized enterprises, they're much more concerned in most instances with other factors that relate to their business, being profitable, and being able to sustain their operations. So I think it's a question of prioritizing certain elements of it, because it's going to be important to establish that you are a responsible component in somebody else's supply chain. And I think as scrutiny increases with some of the tools I mentioned, even if you're relatively far upstream, relatively small in terms of size, the spotlight can be turned on you, and you're going to have to establish that you've got some of the basics in place. It could be ISO 14001 environmental management registration, but even if you're not registered to that system, you should have some basic policies in place, and you should be paying attention in all cases to the types of showstoppers I mentioned. We do not want any of our partners anywhere in the chain to be employing children. We do not want forced labor, which is a scourge, in so many parts of the world. And we certainly don't want to discover that an operation is, horribly dirty from an environmental standpoint, because all of those things could tarnish our reputation in some fashion.
Right, absolutely. So we have a few more minutes, so we'll just grab a few more questions, and then we'll wrap it up. So you touched on it a little bit, but Martin asks, how important are reverse logistics for Flex, and can you comment on some of the practices Flex has in this area?
Yes, the only way to facilitate some of the circular economy concepts I mentioned before is to be able to effectively get goods back to the right places where they can be refurbished, repaired, taken apart and recycled, and so on. And if you think about the range of products we see today, there's a spectrum, along which they fall, where some are easier to collect than others. If you've got low volume industrial products, those can be brought back and then brought to a central location. The challenge that many brands and their partners are facing is that with higher volume products, how do you collect them all and then get them to those same places where the work can be done? And we've seen efforts that have been more or less successful. Maybe you can bring it into your local Best Buy. Maybe you can bring it into some other sort of drop-off location. Maybe you bring it back to the phone store where you purchased the handset to begin with. One of the things we're doing with one of our partners, our customers, I should say, in Brazil, is we have an operation down there that focuses on some of these types of services, and we've applied RFID tags to each and every unit that we produce from them. And so they're able to track it, using handheld devices. And so we can create a log essentially of all the units and figure out, where they are in terms of maintenance, useful life, and so on. Someone else mentioned IoT earlier. Once IoT becomes more prevalent, we'll be able to do a lot of that remotely, and we won't have to have the same manual effort. So it's an absolutely critical element in this whole puzzle. And I think we actually need to see more investment in some of the infrastructure, because today our recycling markets and reverse logistics operations, are not as smooth and not as proliferated as they need to be.
Right, right. Oh, great. Thanks. Great examples. So this is a question that I think is always is sort of it depends. But Samet asks, how are CSR activities affecting the profitability of supply chains, positively or negatively?
I think there's great potential for it to be, a positive. I'll just mention, a couple of examples. In the last year, I've seen many more instances where we were bidding on new business, where my team and I were asked to participate directly in the preparation of our response to the proposals. And then in many of the actual presentations and so on, I've run workshops for prospective customers where we were asked to show them on the ground some of the things I've been speaking about. And we were very fortunate that when the decision was made, it was one of the factors they cited in awarding us the business. In one case, they said, we think you just know how to do this better than we do, and we feel very comfortable working with you. I mean, I was kind of floating for, a couple of weeks there. I mean, that's great type of publicity for the work we do internally. And I think that kind of story can be replicated at any stage of the supply chain. I think there needs to be more attention focused on it, frankly. I mean, a lot of sustainable purchasing programs that we've seen in the past were really more qualification than actual awards of business. And I know I've heard from some colleagues at other companies who have said, we went through a lot of effort to create a more sustainable solution here, and then we just did not get the business. It all came down to cost, quality, or some other more traditional factors. So we need to see more businesses walking the talk here to incentivize us to keep working on these issues. On the flip side, as I said, I think most large companies and their partners like to work through issues rather than immediately disengage or terminate suppliers. So there are many instances of where it's happened, where a supplier has been terminated, but it usually doesn't come immediately. There's usually an effort made to get to the heart of the problem. So my advice to everybody would be, if you're sitting on an issue like that and it comes to your attention and your customers, do not ignore it, because you'll do so at your own risk.
Right, absolutely. Actually, and this next question links perfectly with that, which is, would you share some of, VJ asks, would you share some leadership tips in motivating organizations for CSR efforts?
One I'm very fond of is, we worked through some issues of our own in a part of South Asia where we were employing foreign migrant workers. And through a very concerted effort, we were able to improve those conditions considerably. Workers who had, in some instances, come to us through labor agencies and had paid fees were put under contract to flex directly. We saw that the workers were reimbursed for those fees, and we spent a lot of time and effort improving the hostels where they were housed and other living conditions. And what I'm getting at is I've made an emotional appeal to some of my colleagues based on a lot of that work, and I think they appreciated that, because it's not every day that you come to work and you're able to say, I improved the lives of thousands of individuals. And I think we have to remember that, this is not all just a paper and pen exercise. We're really talking about workers and their families throughout our value chains, and what we're doing has a real impact. Same thing with environment. We need to respect the communities where we operate, and if we can demonstrate a real impact, it's not just to the benefit of our company, it's all of our neighbors and the community where that operation is located. So I like to make those emotional appeals. You don't want to overdo it, but you want to remind people that, what you're working on there. And then the other, of course, is what we've talked about quite a bit now, which is customer pull. When people ask me what's the biggest driver, that's immediately what I offer as an answer. If we're going to delight our customers, we want to establish that we're responsible. And what this really is at the end of the day is trust. They need to trust that they're working with the right partners. We never pretend that we're perfect, but we would like them to trust in that our commitment is real, it's genuine, and that we're working very hard to improve every day. And so they can say the same thing to their stakeholders.
Great. I think actually that's a perfect ending to our interview, and sort of how you can motivate these issues even with the challenges. So we have 10 great questions left, and I'm sorry for those that we didn't get to address today. Just a final sign off, Bruce. Do you have any suggestions for our supply chain learners as they continue their professional career? Any final advice?
Yeah, the other thing I would say is that we're talking about what really is an interdisciplinary sort of effort. So, and I'm sure everyone is participating in this course can appreciate that. I need to understand logistics sufficiently so that I can converse intelligently with my colleagues. They need to educate me on how that part of the business runs. I can educate them on greenhouse gas management and some of the issues there and so on. Same thing is true with supply chain management, with human resources, and so on. I mean, at various times in my career, I called myself an environmental professional. I probably have more background there than in other areas. But in the last 5 years, I've spent so much time working on human rights that now I've gotten enough expertise there to be effective. But there are people who spend every minute of their working life on those issues, and I don't pretend to be as versed as they are. So you've got to do two things. Number one, make yourself more intelligent on all of those subjects. But I mentioned before collaboration. This is a team effort, and so you need to understand how to work effectively with others, and then together you can tackle these issues. So that involves communication, analysis, many of the soft skills that everyone will be familiar with, but don't overlook them.
Right. That's great advice, and definitely working across supply chain, working across company departments, working across the supply chain. I think it's a huge lesson, and then also one that we try to enforce in our courses as well. So it's great to be reinforced by yourself. Great. So we came up the hour. I want to be conscious of everyone's time. Thank you everyone for joining us. It was a great discussion, great questions. Sorry we didn't get to them all. And finally, of course, thank you so much, Bruce, for joining us. It was a super interesting discussion, and we really appreciate all your insight today.
Yeah, my pleasure, Alexis. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.